My name is Anna Reed, and I'm 72 years old. What I'm about to tell you should never have happened. It's a story about a betrayal so cold, it chilled the very foundations of my family. A betrayal that began with the very scent of money and ended in the deepest sorrow imaginable. The memory of it is still sharp, like splinters caught beneath the skin, a constant, nagging ache in the quiet moments of the night. The day my husband, George Reed, died was a Friday, gray and relentless. The sky over Oakhaven looked exactly like cheap flannel, dull, heavy, and utterly without promise. It felt like the world was holding its breath, a thick, suffocating stillness that pressed against the small, two-story house George and I had shared for 5 decades. He collapsed suddenly while working in his beloved workshop. The doctor, a young man named Dr. Miller who hadn't known George's vitality, diagnosed it immediately. Heart failure, he declared. Quick and painless. That's what they always say when they don't want to dig too deep, when they prefer to accept the simplest explanation. They want to sanitize the ending, to make it neat and clinical. But that finality felt anything but painless to me. It felt like being cleaved in two, the half of my soul that was George suddenly ripped away, leaving a gaping, ragged void where laughter and sawdust smells used to reside. I met George when I was 22, fresh out of teacher's college and full of bright, if modest, ideals, teaching third grade in a small, dusty town named Oakhaven. It wasn't the kind of place people dreamed of leaving. It was the kind of place people chose to settle down in, trading the frantic chase of ambition for the deep, abiding satisfaction of stability and community. He was the town's silent hero, the local carpenter, the man who could fix anything with wood and wisdom. If a chair was wobbly, a porch rail cracked, or a child needed a simple wooden toy carved with meticulous care, George was the one. His hands, though often scarred and stained with varnish, were gentle and strong. He was strong in character, reliable in every sense of the word, and utterly devoted to the life we built and to the community we lived in. Our life was modest, built on the sweet scent of sawdust that always clung to his clothes, the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock he made for me on our 10th anniversary, and shared promises whispered on our porch swings. We raised one daughter, Elira, who moved away to the sprawling city but came back often enough to give us three beautiful grandchildren. Sam, 24, Vivian, 21, and Mark, 18. They were meant to be our comfort, our legacy, the sweet reward for decades of honest, hard work. Elira married Thomas, a kind but distant man, and they settled in the city, a place George and I never quite understood. Their life was fast, modern, and expensive, governed by quarterly earnings reports and cocktail parties. Our life remained simple. George in his shop from sunrise to sunset, me tending my roses in the small backyard patch he built for me using reclaimed cedar. We didn't have much money. We were secure, with enough savings for our needs, but certainly not wealthy. But we had the deep, quiet respect of the town and a lifetime of true happiness, which, as George always said, was worth more than any stock portfolio or corner office. The funeral was a blur of black dresses and hushed voices. The old stone church smelled overwhelmingly of lilies and ancient incense, a scent that now forever smells of finality to me. I remember Alara weeping heavily on Thomas's shoulder, her grief seeming honest, raw, and completely overwhelming. But the grandchildren were different. Sam was pale and composed, his tie meticulously knotted, his gaze fixed distantly above the casket as if calculating its worth. Vivian was perpetually on her phone, disguised behind a thin black veil, though I could see the constant, restless movement of her thumbs swiping at the screen. Only Mark looked truly lost, like a boy who had stumbled into a tragedy he didn't comprehend, his eyes red-rimmed and confused. As I stood by George's graveside, the pastor's eloquent, if slightly generic, words about resting in peace dissolving into the damp autumn air, I clutched the single white rose I planned to drop onto the casket. Then my phone vibrated, a sudden, sharp, almost painful jolt against the silk lining of my dress pocket. I pulled it out instinctively, trying to be discreet, shielding the screen from the few mourners present. It was a new text from an unknown number. The screen glowed harshly, almost blindingly in the gloom of the cemetery. The lockbox is empty. Tell no one they took it. My hand, already trembling from grief, seized up entirely. The white rose almost slipped from my grasp, its thorns digging slightly into my palm. They? Who was they? The accusation was too specific, too awful to ignore. My mind immediately flashed, despite my better judgment, to Alara and her children. But that was impossible. They were here, grieving. Why would anyone send this? Was this some cruel mistake? A prank born of malice at the absolute worst possible moment? I glanced quickly at Sam, who was standing closest, his back perfectly straight, his composure unnervingly complete. The chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the cold air or the damp earth. It was the chill of dawning horror. I typed back instantly, the letters swimming through my tears, the words forming with difficulty as the reality of the message started to penetrate the fog of my sorrow. What lockbox? Who are you? This is inhumane. The reply came back almost immediately, sharp, condensed, and chillingly specific, leaving no room for doubt or denial. The one under the loose floorboard in the shop. You must find the ledger. Don't trust the children, especially Sam. That moment tore my world in two, irrevocably and violently. My knees felt weak, threatening to buckle, and I had to lean heavily on the arm of my neighbor, Doris, who was thankfully distracted by the pastor's final prayer. The sheer detail, the loose floorboard in the shop, a secret only George and I knew, meant this was no prank. This was a truth, raw and jagged, that I hadn't been prepared to face. The funeral continued, the dirt hitting the casket with a final, hollow thud, but all I could hear was the metallic ring of those text messages, drowning out the pastor's prayers and the muffled sobs of my daughter. For years, I had watched my grandchildren change. Alara and Thomas, our daughter and son-in-law, never pressured us directly about money. They were focused on their demanding city careers. But the grandchildren, they seemed to absorb the city's inherent hunger for status. That insidious, cancerous belief that a person's worth is solely measured in possessions and financial scale. They'd visit Oak Haven, dressed in designer clothes that cost more than George's entire month's income, talking incessantly about their expensive European gap year travels and the necessity of passive income. They treated our simple, comfortable home like a quaint museum exhibit, a relic of a time before smartphones and high-yield investments. Sam, the eldest, was always the most ambitious, almost alarmingly so. He dropped out of his prestigious college business program, not because he failed, but because he claimed formal education was too slow for his vision of starting a disruptive tech venture. He was handsome, charming, articulate, and utterly obsessed with wealth, always asking George questions that veered uncomfortably close to our financial reality, disguised as future planning. Vivian followed his lead, always borrowing money from her mother, always complaining bitterly about their family's shameful lack of a legacy or generational wealth. She saw our life, George's satisfying craft, my modest retirement, as a failure to launch, a testament to caution instead of ambition. Only Mark, the youngest, a quiet boy with George's thoughtful, questioning eyes, seemed somewhat grounded in reality. But even he looked at our small, comfortable house with a tangible pity that used to sting me deeply. A little over a year ago, Sam started visiting George at the shop frequently, claiming a newfound interest in carpentry. He said he was looking into building a portfolio of rental properties and wanted his grandfather's honest advice on cheap, effective renovations and how to spot quality wood. George, always proud to teach his craft to the next generation, spent hours with him, patiently showing him the difference between pine and oak. He asks too many questions about materials, Anna, George told me one evening, his brow furrowed as we sat on the porch. He doesn't want to learn how to build, he wants to learn how much it costs to sell. He's only interested in profit margins, not the integrity of the work. I dismissed it, perhaps too easily, telling George he was being too hard on the boy, that this was simply the way the new generation thought. They're just trying to make their way, my dear. The world is harder for them now, more competitive. George just shook his head, looking out at the sunset washing over my rose bushes, a look of profound disappointment in his eyes. Money has a smell, Anna. It's sweet, metallic, and corrupting, but it rots everything it touches. And the children have caught the scent. That word, scent, hung in the air for months, a chilling premonition I had foolishly chosen to ignore until this devastating moment. That night, my grief was temporarily suppressed, replaced by a cold, surgical focus. I had to know the full, terrible truth. I couldn't afford to mourn George properly until I understood what sinister thing had happened on the very day of his funeral and what threat still lingered. I told Doris I needed to be alone, claiming exhaustion, and as soon as the house was quiet, enveloped in the deep stillness of Oakhaven night, I drove out to George's workshop, a sanctuary that now felt like a mausoleum. The air inside smelled faintly of sawdust, turpentine, and the lingering, sweet residue of his favorite pipe tobacco, a scent that now felt like a final, desperately sweet warning rather than a comfort. I flipped the single light switch, illuminating the familiar organized clutter of tools and wood racks. I walked straight to the back corner near the old workbench. I got down on my knees, ignoring the painful, protesting groan of my elderly joints. I found the loose floorboard exactly where the text implied, disguised beneath a small, deliberate pile of wood shavings that George usually swept up every day before locking up. I swept the dust aside and leveraged the edge with a large, flathead screwdriver. It lifted easily, revealing the shallow cavity beneath. Beneath it was a small, worn leather lockbox. It was antique, given to George by his father on his 10th birthday, a family treasure. My heart hammered against my ribs when I lifted it. It should have been heavy, weighted with the history and financial security of our lives. It was feather light, a sickening emptiness in my hands. I picked the lock with a small, specialized tool George had taught me to use for complicated cabinet work. It clicked open with a chilling sound. I lifted the lid. It was completely empty. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. My hands started to shake uncontrollably, not with sorrow, but with the purest, coldest rage I had ever known. Inside that box should have been our entire life savings, about $30,000 in cash, carefully saved over decades. George distrusted banks after the financial crash and preferred to keep it safe and accessible. The original deed to the house and the shop, passed down through George's family for 3 generations, the legal proof of our existence in Oakhaven. The antique gold pocket watch George inherited from his grandfather, a priceless, irreplaceable family heirloom. All gone, everything. Our safety net, our legacy, and our history. Stolen. The text was terrifyingly right. They took it. And then I saw it, wedged tightly into the back corner of the empty box, pushed deep into the lining, was a small, leather-bound notebook. A ledger George used religiously to track his work commissions, client payments, and materials costs. I opened it and instantly recognized George's neat, deliberate handwriting, the strokes familiar and comforting despite the horror of the situation. I flipped past the pages detailing the cost of oak and the delivery date of cedar planks. The final page, dated exactly 3 weeks ago, was different. It contained only 4 words, written in a hand that looked slightly rushed, slightly shaky, reflecting anxiety. Sam asked, I refused, I fear. I drove home slowly, the empty lockbox and the disturbing ledger resting like heavy stones on the passenger seat. My profound grief for George was now temporarily suspended, utterly compounded by a blinding, terrible rage directed at the calculated greed that had infected my family and destroyed my husband's final weeks. I meticulously thought back to the week George died, playing the memories back like a disturbing film. George had been perfectly healthy, humming Patsy Cline while sanding wood just days before. Then Sam had called, claiming he was flying in for a sudden business opportunity and needed to stay with us, bringing Vivian along, saying she needed a break from the city's pressure. They spent 2 days at the house, clinging to George, asking him constant, probing questions about his health, his retirement plans, and his finances. It felt less like a family visit and more like a targeted inquisition disguised as affection. The day George died, Sam and Vivian had been at the shop with him, ostensibly helping. They claimed they left right before he collapsed, needing to catch an early train back to the city for a critical meeting. Their timing had been too perfect, their alibi too seamless. I had to check the accounts to leave no stone unturned in this awful investigation. I went to the bank the next morning. The teller, Mrs. Peters, a kind woman who knew us from church, looked terribly uncomfortable when I asked about any recent activity on our modest joint account. "Mrs. Reed, I'm so sorry about George," she began, her voice dropping to a low, hesitant whisper. "But he was in here last month with your grandson, Sam. He authorized him to be a secondary signatory on this account." "He did what?" I whispered, the sound barely audible, yet laced with absolute terror. "Yes." Sam said it was just so he could help George pay shop bills electronically if he got sick or couldn't get around easily. George signed the papers, saying it was for peace of mind, but he looked nervous about it. George would never have done that. He was notoriously paranoid about electronic money and used cash for almost everything. But the pieces of the puzzle slammed together violently. The urgent visits, the probing questions, the increased access to the joint account, and the emptied, hollow lockbox. Sam had been positioning himself to control everything, to seize the entire financial landscape, piece by careful piece. But the crucial piece I was still missing was the source of those messages. Who knew this intimate level of detail? Who was brave enough to risk warning me? My phone buzzed again that afternoon, the unknown number filling the screen like a beacon in the darkness. "The police report is flawed. He didn't just collapse. Check the varnish." Sam used it. The word varnish hit me with a jolt of ice water. The simple, specific details, a sealant, a loose floorboard, a ledger, were the signature of someone who knew George's workshop and George's secrets intimately. I drove back to the shop immediately, the anxiety making my vision swim and my hands clammy. This time, I didn't head for the floorboards. I headed straight for the supply shelves where George kept his finishing products. I focused on the varnishes and stains George used on his fine projects. One can of clear sealant, labeled simply wood finish, was new, opened, and sitting slightly apart from the others, sitting suspiciously on the main workbench instead of its assigned shelf. I picked it up. George was meticulously neat. He always stored opened chemicals on the top, organized shelf, closed and clean. He never left a half-used can sitting on the workbench. It was out of place. It was a clue. I took the can home, wrapping it carefully in a clear plastic evidence bag. I stared at the anonymous number on my phone, finally daring to make the connection that had been lurking at the edge of my consciousness. Mark. Mark was the only one who seemed genuinely upset, the only one who had George's quiet, watchful nature and knowledge of the shop's inner workings. A few hours later, my hands trembling, I called the number. It rang twice, and then a nervous, young voice answered. It was Mark, my youngest grandson. "Grandma Anna, is that really you? I can't believe you called." His voice cracked, relief and terror mixing in the tone. Mark, tell me everything, I commanded, my voice strained but carefully steady, demanding the full, awful truth. Why did you send those texts? Who did this to your grandfather? Mark burst into tears, the sound muffled and heartbroken, echoing the grief of the entire family. They found the ledger, Grandma. Sam and Vivian poisoned him. The confession spilled out in ragged, horrific bursts, interspersed with Mark's gasping sobs. He explained the unthinkable, that his older siblings had conspired to murder their own grandfather for money. Mark had been there, not during the final, lethal act, but during the preparation and the aftermath. He explained that he had walked into the shop the day George died, but earlier than he was supposed to, intending to surprise his grandfather. He saw Sam putting a strange, colorless liquid into George's favorite, insulated water bottle, the one George always kept near the sanding machine, using a small, clinical-looking syringe. Sam had quickly capped the can of sealant and told Mark sharply that he was just cleaning up some specialized epoxy, and that Mark should go wait in the house. Mark had a sinking feeling, a dread that coiled in his stomach, but he was too afraid to challenge his dominating older brother. Sam had spent weeks researching colchicine, a highly toxic alkaloid substance found in certain seeds. When properly administered, it causes severe gastrointestinal and cardiac symptoms that perfectly mimic sudden, natural heart failure, especially in an older man. It was the perfect, untraceable poison. Sam was bragging to Vivian later that night, after they got back to the city, Mark sobbed. He told her he put the liquid into a can of varnish sealant so he could keep the remainder hidden without suspicion, since the sealant was clear. He then used the syringe to contaminate Grandpa's water bottle, knowing the initial collapse would look like a heart attack, exactly like the doctor diagnosed. The motive was laid bare, cold and sharp. George, frustrated by their incessant greed and realizing his eldest grandson was dangerously ambitious, had recently drafted a new official will with his lawyer, leaving the house and shop to a local community charity, and only small, specific sums to his grandchildren. Sam knew he needed the old deed and the cash before George could execute the new will, or, worse, decide to spend or disperse the cash. He had meticulously emptied the lockbox immediately after George's death, knowing I would be distracted by the funeral arrangements, stealing the deed before the new one could be legally filed. Vivian had stood watch at the front door of the shop while he did it. Mark, too terrified of Sam and Vivian to go directly to the police, had realized his grandfather's death was a lie. He was the one who, during the chaos of the police arriving, had quickly grabbed the ledger from the exposed lockbox when Sam and Vivian weren't looking. He was trying to lead me to the truth, quietly, safely, through those anonymous texts, risking everything. I hung up the phone. The true nature of my family, the quiet, hidden evil masked by expensive suits and forced smiles, was now undeniable. It was a cold, calculated murder born of financial desperation, arrogance, and a staggering lack of humanity. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the sealed can of poison. The rage that had been a low simmer now reached a boiling point, but I forced myself to be George's widow, calm, meticulous, and focused on justice. I called the police immediately, contacting Sergeant Evans, a seasoned officer who respected George. I didn't mention Mark. I needed to protect him from his murderous siblings. 2 officers arrived quickly. They looked skeptical until I handed them the ledger containing George's final, fearful note, the bank statements detailing the unauthorized account changes, and the clear plastic bag containing the can of wood finish sealant. I told them the story without emotion, giving them the facts in the precise, chronological order they occurred. Forensic testing began immediately. Within 24 hours, the lab confirmed the presence of the deadly toxin in the sealant. The toxicology reports from George's body, which had been quickly filed under natural causes, were hastily re-examined by the medical examiner, and they revealed traces of the same lethal alkaloid. Sam was arrested 2 days later at a coffee shop near his city apartment. He showed no remorse, only surprise that his perfect plan had been exposed by an old ledger and a phone text. Vivian, who had helped with the lockbox and was complicit in the cover-up, was arrested for theft and conspiracy. The full weight of the law fell upon them. The scandal was immediate, brutal, and public. Elira and Thomas, stunned and heartbroken, flew into town, realizing they had enabled the atmosphere of greed and entitlement that ultimately destroyed their father and fractured their family. Elira blamed herself bitterly for not keeping a closer eye on her children, for focusing on status and superficial success instead of character. My life with George was simple and honest. His death was neither. But standing here, weeks later, with the truth finally exposed and the poison removed from my home, I feel the kind of strength George always had. It's the strength that comes not from wealth, but from upholding what is right, even when the right path means destroying the idea of your own family. I will rebuild the life George and I shared. The stolen cash has been recovered, the deed is safe, and the antique watch is back in my possession. I will honor George's memory by living exactly as he taught me, with integrity, caution, and love for the simple truth. Mark is back in Oak Haven, living with me now. He's struggling deeply with the trauma, but he is fundamentally good and honest. I am helping him find his footing, gently reminding him that integrity is the true inheritance. Life moves on. The sun still sets over Oak Haven, painting my rose garden in soft, forgiving colors. The memory of George will always be my strength, a constant reminder that true value is found not in what you acquire, but in how you choose to live and love. And as I sit here now, amidst the silence George left behind, and amidst the peace that Mark brings back into this house, I know what my true legacy is. It isn't the deed to the house or the recovered savings. No. I learned the hardest, the most agonizing, the most devastating lesson a matriarch can ever face. A lesson that tears at the very fabric of one's purpose in life. It is this, that sometimes the most profound and cruelest betrayals are not inflicted by strangers, but are whispered and carried out by the children you raised and by the grandchildren you nurtured and cherished. You look at them and see love, but they look back and only see opportunity. But even in that darkness, there is light. Because the greatest truths, the very ones that save your soul and allow you to keep breathing, those truths are often found not in grand pronouncements or legal documents, but in the silent language of a carpenter's ledger, in the evidence hidden beneath a forgotten floorboard, and in the quiet, desperate courage of a good boy who risked everything to speak for the dead. Never underestimate the small, quiet signs. They are the keys to salvation. So, tell me, have you ever trusted someone only to realize they were hiding a truth right in front of your eyes? Comment below and share your story and the lesson you learned from the betrayal. And if this story reminded you that wisdom is the greatest wealth, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our family. Until next time, stay watchful and stay strong.